those sounds for anybody else.
I'm special.
Yeah. Thanks, Santino, for whatever you did. Looks like that may have gotten it. Yeah. We're glad everybody's here today. Isn't it nice to see the sunshine shining? If I had had some money, I would have put $1 in for the road being fixed on Signal Mountain. What do you think about that, Ray? Or I would have put $1, George, in for that card that came with your early life pictures on it to our house. I have enjoyed that so much.
My mother would have too.
His mother would too. That's pretty good. We appreciate having visitors. Glad you're here today. Ben, he looks like he can take care of himself pretty well. But like he might need to be fed from time to time. I expected that there would be nice contributions this morning with Alabama's victory, but I guess you folks were nice enough not to rub it in on the Georgia people, so God bless you. Jane, I think you made everybody happy, so all of that was a ruse, of course. Jane just said that we need to kind of crank up the joy jar a little bit. So. I started working on this lesson first thing yesterday morning. I'll save what I had. I am not a political scientist, and this is not going to be a lesson in political science, although it probably will sound like it right at the very beginning. I was touched by the life of George Herbert Walker Bush, and thinking that it would be fitting in this environment to pay some kind of tribute to him, and especially a particular part of his life. So that's what this lesson's going to come to. I would say at first, in full disclosure, I did not vote for George Herbert Walker Bush. But when the election was coming down to the end, and I was sitting on a panel, and how the election was going was being discussed, I was kind of stationed on the left side of that panel, if you get my drift. And so a number of people were very surprised when it came around to my turn to speak. And I said in a very straightforward manner that I thought that if George Herbert Walker Bush were elected president in that coming election, that our country would be in really fine shape, that we did not have anything to worry about in that regard. I said that because I really felt like that if any of the presidents that I had known, that he was probably the most qualified person that had run till that time, perhaps, maybe ever. And even more than that, I thought that he was a good person, and I've always been compelled to believe that politics was much more about voting for a person than voting for a party or voting for a policy. I had personally always been and have continued to be a centrist and a moderate when it comes to politics. Now my brother, who's dead now, who was an arch advocate of George Wallace and very engaged in his run for the presidency, he would not agree with that. But I always felt like that America was at its best when you had people who were centrist or people who were moderates of both parties who could come together and find ways of working to make our country move forward in a positive way. From the time of Teddy Roosevelt, which is around the turn of the last century, there have been a number of very important centrists or moderates who have been Republican presidential candidates or who have been successful in that regard. I know I'll take some of you down memory lane, but Wendell Willkie was probably that kind of a person. Thomas Dewey was kind of that kind of a person. Without any equivocation, Dwight Eisenhower was that kind of a person. And I think that those of us, especially who were aware enough to see the kind of presidency that Eisenhower crafted, we understand that He was a man who had led us not only as an Army general, but also as a very good president. I have been very comfortable with those kind of people. I liked Ike. Remember how we said that? I felt uncomfortable with the right end of that political party. I felt uncomfortable with Nixon a bit, even more with Goldwater, and then with Reagan, in the very same way that I have felt uncomfortable with the left far wing of the Democratic Party. I would tell you, without feeling like I'm in a confessional booth, that I voted for Howard Baker every time he ran. He was my kind of person. I will tell you that I voted for Bob Corker every time he ran. He was my kind of person. I would even tell you that I would really hope in the back of my mind to have a chance to vote for Bob Corker again, but that's a story for another time. I see George Herbert Walker Bush as the last great centrist Republican president that we have had. I wish that his son would have listened more to him than he did to Dick Cheney, or I wish that he would have let Jim Baker, who had helped him so much, get inside the White House of his son. And I wouldn't be surprised if his son, coming maybe to appreciate his father much more beyond his own presidency, might not say the same thing. I loved it when George H.W. Bush talked about 1,000 points of light. And it was the right far wing of his party that thought that was a weak statement and that he should take it out of the public addresses that he made. He refused to do that. I liked it when a man who had said, "Read my lips, no more taxes," found the country at the end of his first term getting into a great deal of economic problems and being brave enough to say that he had said the wrong thing and that he was not going to live by that. And I pretty much believe, and you all know as much about politics as I do, that it was the far right wing of his party that got so upset about that allowed Bill Clinton to win. And so I think that George H.W. Bush was a true American that needs to be admired. Well, so much for the political science lesson. What I'm interested in talking about today is elements of that man's faith that I think are very important for us to be aware of and for us to think about in relationship to our country. He was raised an Episcopalian, which would probably have been normal to his kind of demographic station in life in the world of the Northeast that he was born into. His mother was the primary spiritual influence of his life and left a deep, deep impression on him. His mother made sure, like my mother did and like maybe many of your mothers did, that his day and the day of his siblings was ended with Bible study and prayer. As a young boy, he had no memory of ever going to bed at night without his mother reading from the Bible, without his mother making him memorize large sections of the Common Book of Prayer, and without his mother talking to him about a man named John Bailey, B-A-I-L-L-E. I imagine you haven't been talking about John Bailey this morning, but if you go back to the early part of the last century, John Bailey was one of the more important voices in religion and theology in the world. He taught at prestigious universities in England and in this country. He was a frequent lecturer in this country, and his books were as popular in his day and time, probably not as much as Billy Graham's in our day and time, but very, very popular. John Bailey taught this, and this is what I'd really love for you to think about. He said, a lot of people think about God. God is a very frequent visitor to our thinking processes, he would say. And that's true. A lot of people think about God. John Bailey said that a lot of people have experiences that they identify as God experiences. They may be experiences, he said, where they confront God in the beauty of nature. They may be experiences of God when they feel like they're confronting God with the presence of conscience that's drawing them to do what is right and do what is good. And so he said people think a lot about God, and people talk sometimes about experiences that, are God-type experiences. Then John Bailey said, but that does not constitute faith in God. So to think about God, or to talk about God, or to reflect on experiences that you think may have been experiences, John Bailey said, that is not faith. He said, faith occurs when we take our knowledge of God and when we take our experiences with God and we translate that into the day-to-day way that we live as moral and ethical people who serve others. The core of George H.W. Bush's faith was a mother who prayed with him daily, a mother who read to him daily the Bible, a mother who etched into his brain prayers from the Common Book of Prayer, and a woman who taught her son that faith was not just talking about God or having some kinds of experiences with God, but faith began to occur when we begin to live for God and live in godly ways and serve in godly ways the people around us. He believed that those experiences as a child with his mother and what she taught him was at the very pulsating heart and core of his life. I think that's very important, because I think that sometimes in our world we don't have generationally a lot of passed down of things relating to God. And I think that's important because I believe that in our day and time, sometimes just to be able to talk about God or think about God or have God experiences as a kind of part of our ceremonial and cultural life, sometimes that is what we call faith. That would certainly have been an inadequate faith for this man. I think that would have been an inadequate faith for Jesus. Second thing that relates to his faith that tells you an awfully lot about him. Most of you know that as a young man at the beginning of the Second World War, he left the comfort of his kind of really well-to-do Upper East Coast lifestyle and joined the U.S. Navy. He felt like he needed to serve his country. He became a naval aviator. He flew off of aircraft carriers in the Pacific Ocean. My guess is anybody I've ever known that ever flew off an aircraft carrier, you can tell Bernie we said this, pretty brave person if you ask me. Probably a very happy person when they landed it back down on that carrier. He flew a dive bomber, and the dive bomber he flew on had him as the pilot, had a second person who was primarily the bombardier, and had a third person that was primarily a machine gunner who was to protect that airplane. In 1944, fighting against the Japanese, his plane was shot down. The first thing that George Bush did was to make sure that he flew to the place that he thought he could get to that was most safe, that would allow his crewmates to dive out of a plane that hadn't become erratic in its flight. Soon after they had jumped out of the plane with their parachutes safely, the plane began to just fall apart, and so he jumped out as well. He hit his head on the back end of the plane. He said it could have cut his head off. He got his parachute tangled up in the back part of the plane, but it miraculously came loose, and he floated down to the ocean, was in a life raft, and was waiting for the Japanese to come and probably kill him. He said, however, that the first thought that was on his mind, was not the terrible circumstance he was in, not so much what would happen next in his life, but the first thought in his mind was, why has God spared me? And what does God have for me? The first thought of his life at that moment of great turmoil was what God might have for him in his future. And in a moment or two, an American submarine surfaced that was out there trying to rescue downed pilots. And all of us have seen those famous videos of George Bush being pulled up onto that submarine and being saved. What has God spared me for? What does he want me to do? Of all of the first questions that someone could have cross their minds at that moment, that's a dandy. And then, of course, I think most of us that know his story know that he had a wonderful little girl named Robin that was the light of his life. And at 3 years of age, Robin contracted leukemia, and although they used all the resources that were available to their family and their extended family, the little girl died. And it was the worst thing that had ever happened to George Bush and to his wife. And he said at times when he would reflect back on that, the only thing that allowed me to get through that was my faith in God. He said, I could not explain what had happened, and I did not understand what had happened. He said there were times in which I went beyond grief to great anger about what had happened. But he said, none of that defrayed me from the belief that somehow God would help us sustain ourselves and that God would bring us through that. He said it was only faith in God that allowed us to get through something that was that terrible and that awful. And then finally, Barbara Bush kind of comes into the scene. And I believe that woman must have been a real character. The people that I know in Texas that knew Barbara Bush would say that. They tell me that when she moved to Houston, that the first thing she did was to buy a car. And that she had not been able to drive because of all of his dignified responsibilities for all the years. And that he insisted that the Secret Service go out and buy her the biggest old Chevrolet that they could possibly find. And said that that car, before it finally died, was probably the most dented up car in their very highbrow area of Houston where they lived. Barbara Bush would say sometimes, great honesty, and with a little bit of amazement, I think, he really prayed. And that he took prayer seriously. She said every night before he went to bed, he got down on his knees beside his bed and prayed. And he said every night that he could wrestle me in the room, he insisted that I needed to pray as well, and I probably did. And she was stunned that this man, with his education and experience and background and on, she said he actually prayed and believed that praying was important. My wife tells me frequently that I should work on my diet. I've done that many times in my life. My most natural comeback to her is that I don't have time. And I can really give her lots of reasons why I don't have time. And she puts up with that a little bit, but usually has some very good comebacks. I hear people talk about dieting as the number one thing that they don't have time to do. If you look at some of the studies that are out there, people seem to say that praying is the number two thing that they don't have time to do. My wife used to say to me, when Jimmy Carter was president, if Jimmy Carter can go out and run every day, you can. You've got time. And I think about George Bush, and I think about if a man with all the things that had to be swimming through his head, and with all the responsibilities he had, and all the things that he had to do, if he could never go to bed at night without stopping to pray, then maybe we've got time to pray as well. That's a wonderful tribute to anybody that their wife would say about them. He really prayed. He really prayed every night. But what I remember most about George H.W. Bush is when he was inaugurated for president. And all the ceremonial things were dispensed with, and it came time for him to give his speech. And you can imagine that if you ever had a chance to make a speech like that you would have thought it from inside out, upside down, from one end to the other. And George Bush got up and said, can you remember this? He said, the first act of my presidency will be to pray. And he bowed his head, and he asked everybody in that assembled group of thousands upon thousands of people to bow their heads and pray with him to God. That's unprecedented in the whole history of the American presidency, that an American president's first statement in an inaugural address was a prayer. And here's what he stood on that podium and prayed. First of all, he said in his prayer to God, thank you for your love. Pretty good place to start. He said in his prayer, give us strength to know your will. He said in his prayer, and then help us to hear and heed your will. And at the end of his prayer, he said, and God, write on our hearts, use power to help people. Now, it just blows me away. Of all of the things that we hear in political conversation across our lives, and all of the things that we hear in political conversation today, for a man to stand up, having become President of the United States, and pray to God, write on our hearts, use power to help people. I don't think that happened by chance. And I don't think that happened as some part of a pious act. I think that happened as the primary essential expression of a man's faith and a man's relationship to God. The most powerful man in the world at that moment, praying that God would help him use his power to help people. And of course, I was kind of impressed by the way he and Bill Clinton put together their friendship, which was very real, and we'll see that in the next few days. He would always say about Clinton, he's kind of a pretty funny guy. We don't know what all he meant by funny, but we kind of get the drift. And then he would say, it is very important for people to understand that they can believe differently politically, and that they can be at different ends of political spectrums, and that doesn't mean that they have to be enemies. What a great lesson there is in using power to help people. What a great lesson there is in understanding we can think different politically, and that doesn't mean we have to be enemies. Here was a man, one of the most give your life to public service people that our nation has ever seen. And here's a man who distinctly believed that his life was to be lived through the lens of the will of God and the way that the will of God brought us to serve other people. May God bless George H.W. Bush and the kind of influence and kind of person that he was. May he find peace and rest in the arms of God. And may we find the kind of people, both Democrats and Republicans, that can lead us to a place where we can cooperate with each other and help each other and maybe even love each other again. Let us pray. And Father, we're thankful for the lives of people who have given their time and their energy to the service of this country. We're thankful especially, our Father, for those people who have paid the greatest price, who've literally given their lives for us to have the kind of country that we have. We're thankful for the greatness of our country and for the potential that our country has and for the influence for good that our country has always been. Help us that we might find ways where there will be centers where we can meet each other. Help us to find ways when we can stop all of our enemy talk and all of our tribal hatreds and separations. And help us, oh God, that we might really and truly find at the core of our lives a way to commune with you, and a way to listen to you, and a way to be led by you. Because surely we know that only as we are led by you will our country be the kind of country that we believe you desire us to be. That only when we are led by you will we be the kind of people that we believe you would want us to be. We ask our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you all for coming today. Hope you'll have a good week.